Dragon Age Inquisition was released in 2014, receiving generally favorable reviews and earning praise for its expansive world, memorable companions, and depth of its lore. On the surface, it appears to be a brilliant return for the franchise after the turbulent reception of Dragon Age 2. But putting aside those great reviews, cracks were already beginning to show. Many players and fans started to question the direction of Dragon Age as a series. Some expressed disappointment with the gradual shift away from the design philosophy established in Dragon Age Origins. Others went even further, suggesting that the game signaled the downfall of bioware itself. Dragon Age Inquisition is a fascinating case study. It is an ambitious game filled with impressive production values and moments of genuine artistic might. At the same time, it represents a strange departure from the original artistic vision of the franchise. This is the embodiment of the contradictions that have shaped Dragon Age so far. Even so, Inquisition went ahead and obtained the Game of the Year award for the year 2014.
The winner is Dragon Age Inquisition.
Winning against difficult opponents such as Dark Souls 2 and Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. Was it deserved? We will find out together in this fine episode of Dragon Age Retrospective and Legacy. My name is Henry Hoffman Myers, your Hex Grid scientist, and today we will analyze Dragon Age Inquisition. If you enjoyed this series, don't forget to leave a like, share and subscribe to my channel for more in-depth analysis of gameplay systems and merciless critiques. Without any further ado, let's begin.
Enchanter, the time has come to be alive in the circle of Magi where we will thrive.
The character creation system is exactly what you would expect from a modern AAA RPG. Dragon Age Inquisition clearly tries to improve on what its predecessors offered. This time, the player can choose from 4 races, the newcomer being the Qunari. Naturally, I will stick with my female elf because, as everyone knows, that is obviously the superior race. Aside from race, the player can also select their preferred combat style, with classes being grouped around the way they approach combat. I have to say from the very beginning that I really like the presentation here. Using illustrated cards, very reminiscent of Tarot, to represent the classes is a brilliant stylistic choice. They are colorful, expressive, and full of character. Points for that. As expected, the customization itself is extensive. There are plenty of sliders, presets, facial adjustments, and a large number of visual options. From a purely technical standpoint, the character creator is excellent. Nothing feels missing and the level of control is impressive. Now personally, I've never been a huge fan of heavy slider systems. With enough patience, you can create a beautiful, charming character or an absolute monstrosity worthy of being cleansed with napalm. But the flexibility is there, and that is ultimately a good thing. The only aspect that truly bothered me is the shift in aesthetic direction. Many of the characters in this game look fantastic. Cassandra and Leliana, for example, received redesigns that I think were executed beautifully. The problem appears when you try to recreate that same aesthetic with the player character. I spent a considerable amount of time adjusting sliders and even revisited the character later, since the game allows you to modify your appearance, but I struggled to create a female Inquisitor that I would describe as aesthetically pleasing. Now, I won't accuse bioware of anything just yet. My own lack of proficiency with the sliders may very well be part of the problem. But from my experience, creating a conventionally attractive female Inquisitor without mods is surprisingly difficult. Just look at this, she looks like Marilyn Manson's long-lost sister. God damn it. Well, it will have to suffice. While we are on the subject of appearance, the body proportions of the elves are quite strange. It is not as extreme as it was in Dragon Age 2, but the very slender build combined with the relatively large head creates an odd, almost uncanny silhouette. At times, it feels highly unnatural. Still, putting those issues aside, the character creator itself is excellent. It offers a large number of options and plenty of room for personalization. From a technical perspective, this is a clear improvement over previous entries. And to be completely honest, I'm glad to see that kind of progress. Now, let's talk about the combat system.
Enchanters, the time has come to be alive in the circle of Magi where we will thrive without...
It is often said that the best compromise is the one that leaves all parties unsatisfied, and this is the perfect definition I can use for Inquisition's fighting style. Dragon Age Inquisition attempts something quite confusing. Instead of committing to the tactical design of Dragon Age Origins or the faster action-oriented approach of Dragon Age 2, Inquisition tries to combine both philosophies into a single system, and the result is... curious. The tactical camera returns, allowing players to pause the battle and issue commands to their party members from a strategic overhead view. Positioning, targeting, and ability coordination once again become part of the player's toolkit. You can also see an enemy's resistance and the debuffs that are present, but the transition from action camera to tactical camera feels oddly sharp. I also activated it a couple of times by mistake. In practice, the game rarely demands tactical oversight because encounters are balanced around the Inquisition's direct actions rather than coordinated party tactics. The tactical camera itself is rather clunky. Navigating the battlefield from this perspective often feels awkward, especially in uneven terrain or tight environments. Instead of feeling like a natural way to control the party, it sometimes feels like a feature that was added to reassure fans that the tactical gameplay of earlier entries had not been forgotten. It is a deeply restrictive system that mimics functionality instead of delivering. It is now clear for everyone that bioware decided to shift forever from the usual real-time with pause formula. The combat system in Dragon Age Inquisition is an improved format of the one presented in Dragon Age 2. Abilities operate on cooldowns, characters rely heavily on their active skills, and encounters are built around managing these cooldown cycles rather than carefully planning long-term tactical fights. I don't think it is necessarily bad, it just looks like there are a lot of redundant systems that offer little to no rewards for actually using them. The main combat loop revolves around cooldown cycling. Once an ability is used, the player enters a short window where basic attacks and positioning fill the gap until cooldowns refresh. This is applicable only in early stages of the game, as later there are multiple ways to keep spamming abilities. The game also introduces two new defensive resources, Guard and Barrier, which are extremely important as the characters no longer recover health when out of combat. Also, there are no healing abilities, so managing these two defensive resources becomes imperative. The only healing available are potions, which are limited in number and replenished during rests. And to be completely honest with you, I think this is absolutely great. I despise potion chugging contests. Having to actually manage defensive abilities is a great idea. Good job on this one. To summarize, cooldown design replaces tactical decision making with rotation optimization. There is also a hidden system that is so poorly explained by the game many people don't even take interest in. I am talking about the stagger system. Like I said, there are three defensive layers: barrier, guard, and the usual armor rating. Barrier and guard have to be removed before dealing real damage to the target. This creates a strange rock-paper-scissors approach and puts more emphasis on party composition. A warrior deals high impact damage which removes guard, a mage is proficient in removing barriers, and the rogues deliver high burst damage once defensive layers are broken. This creates a specific combat rhythm. Targets can also be staggered when struck by abilities with high impact values, temporarily interrupting their actions. This is quite similar to the break meters found in JRPGs. In Inquisition, this meter is just hidden. Why is it so important? Because it actually creates an encounter pattern. The party applies control and defensive layers, tries to remove the defensive layers of the other party, then there is a window for bursting down the vulnerable targets. This pattern repeats across most encounters, which inevitably leads to combat feeling repetitive over time. Unfortunately, this system led to catastrophic boss encounter design. Elites and especially bosses end up with very large health pools, multiple and frequent defensive layers, the usual swarming tactic and high stagger resistance. Add reduced crowd control vulnerability and we have the recipe for disaster. I literally lost interest in playing a quest line because a boss encounter was just stupid. I'm talking about the Descent DLC. Just look at this gameplay footage. If there is a god of good design, he has abandoned bioware a long time ago. I revisited the DLC later when my party was better equipped and guess what? Level scaling. Write this one down. Level scaling is a terrible idea. The result was the same, so I lost my interest altogether. Let me explain. When you are implementing automatic level scaling, you are using some mathematical formulas in the background. The stats are increasing according to this formula. If you have the knowledge of a hedgehog when it comes to mathematics, that scaling will end up in insane health pools and resistance stats, aside from killing any sense of progression. If you want an example, use World of Warcraft Legion. Blizzard had to implement a stat shrink after it because the numbers were simply astronomical. Don't add this stuff in your game. Another limitation quickly becomes apparent. The number of abilities that can be actively equipped is quite small. There are no additional hotbars and there are clearly more abilities than slots. Each character can only place a limited set of abilities on their action bar, which means that even though the talent trees appear larger, only a fraction of those abilities can actually be used during combat. This feels like a noticeable reduction in tactical flexibility. The tactics system is also significantly simplified. Compared to Origins, where players could access a wider arsenal of abilities and conditions and thus being able to configure fairly complex behavior rules for companions, in Inquisition, those options are significantly reduced. This gets me back to what I said before. As long as the player correctly uses his abilities on the battlefield, there is no need to manage the party. This is a strange turn of events. But probably one of the biggest changes is the transition from mechanical hits to visual hits. Dragon Age Origins uses a dice roll style to bring attacks to their conclusion. Inquisition uses collision-based hit detection. I know this was also present in Dragon Age 2 to a certain degree, but now you can really miss abilities. The ability has to visually make contact with the enemy in order for the hit to happen and damage be taken. Honestly, it is not bad, but a bit more difficult to get used to in the early hours of the game. I think this is a good way and logical way to make the viewer understand that damage did occur. Also, those beautiful gap closers so well done in Dragon Age 2 are out the door. Just great. All these changes created a curious hybrid. The game presents itself as a tactical RPG, but the underlying combat flow often resembles a cooldown-driven action system. As a result, it manages to completely misrepresent both systems. It is the embodiment of the "you had one job" meme. In trying to satisfy both design philosophies at once, Dragon Age Inquisition ends up occupying an awkward middle ground, one that works well enough moment to moment, but never quite achieves the clarity or depth of either of its predecessors. The result is a combat system that sits between two identities. It retains the appearance of tactical combat, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is primarily driven by cooldown management and ability rotation. Where have I seen this before? Oh right, MMORPGs.
Enchanters, the time has come to be alive in the circle of Magi where we will thrive with
Dragon Age Inquisition was released at the pinnacle of what I like to call the Ubisoft open world era. This represents one of the most important shifts in Dragon Age, the transition from curated RPG environments to large open zones. Previous entries were structured around tightly designed areas where narrative progression and encounter placement were closely connected. Each location served a clear story purpose, and exploration usually led to meaningful discoveries. In Inquisition, that design philosophy changes dramatically. Instead of compact narrative spaces, the game introduces expansive regions such as the Hinterlands, the Western Approach, and others. At first glance, these areas appear impressive. The maps are large, visually diverse, and filled with points of interest scattered across the landscape. However, the underlying design of these spaces leaves a lot to be desired. The map becomes actively driven rather than being structured around story progression. Most regions are organized around activity clusters. When the player enters a zone, the map quickly fills with icons representing tasks. The most notable being closing rifts, clearing enemy camps, and collecting resources. Instead of discovering content organically, the player is essentially following a checklist. The exploration of areas is tied to new systems, the power level of the Inquisition, which acts as a consumable resource and progression gating, and the war table. We will take it one by one. The power of the Inquisition is one of the core systems that governs progression in Dragon Age Inquisition. Unlike traditional RPGs where the main story advances simply through quest completion, Inquisition introduces power as a strategic currency that determines when the player can access major story missions. The idea behind the system is tied to the narrative. The Inquisition is not a group of adventurers. It is an expanding political and military organization. Power represents influence, resources, and authority. Power is gained primarily by engaging with activities in the open world regions. Instead of being tied directly to combat or leveling, it is generated by completing various tasks scattered across the maps. The easiest way to obtain it is by closing fade rifts. A really boring task, as every rift behaves the same way. Fight through 2 waves of enemies, then close the rift. This leads to yet another loop. You enter a new region, you complete activities, gain power, unlock another region, and so on. This also leads to a somewhat strange situation that once again reminds me of World of Warcraft, this time vanilla. The way the zones are designed often requires you to grind activities in multiple zones at once, as you will inevitably meet enemies that are way above your level in a zone that was fine hours ago, or different obstacles that require the use of the war table in order to overcome. From a design perspective, the power system serves 2 main purposes. It paces the main storyline by requiring power to unlock key missions, and it reinforces the fantasy of building an organization. Obviously, we are talking about Dragon Age here, so no good idea remains unpunished. This system comes with massive side effects. Although it is a pretty solid system, it forces the player to grind open world activities. Usually it wouldn't be that bad, but the open world activities feel insignificant and small. That's why I call this Ubisoft open world design. You are doing a lot of nothing. By combining this with the trivialization of side quests, we end up with absolutely nothing. This is already a cliché of this series. You have a solid system that is dragged down by other irrelevant or poorly designed systems. The war table system is probably the most distinctive system introduced in Dragon Age Inquisition. On paper, it is meant to represent the strategic command structure of the Inquisition. Instead of simply acting as a wandering adventurer, the player now leads an organization that operates across the entire continent. The war table is presented as a strategic planning interface where the player sends agents, soldiers, and diplomats to resolve problems beyond the battlefield. Again, conceptually, this is a great idea. The player experiences the fantasy of being a leader, delegating missions, taking advantages of their advisors, and choosing the best approach. In theory, this should be the peak of roleplay, but like I said, no good idea remains unpunished. The missions are executed through a rather unsavory mechanic that I have not seen since the era of Facebook games such as Burn Body. Timer-based structure. Imagine this, we have a polished AAA experience that is basing its most unique mechanic on a system that was implemented in a time of severe hardware limitations. Games like Icarium, Farmville, or Kingdoms of Camelot, all browser games use this system. And do you know why? Because they relied on daily loggings and spending real money to instantly solve the problem. If this kind of system is allowed to exist in single-player games, sooner or later microtransactions will hit them. Microtransactions in single-player games. And yes, I'm fully aware it has already happened. Once an advisor is assigned to a mission, the player must wait for the operation to complete. Real-life minutes and hours. Depending on the mission, this can take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours or even above a day. And you know what's funny? This mechanic is tied to your PC clock. By changing the hour on your PC, you will complete the quests. The result and story behind the events on the war table are explained through text. That's it. Plain text. This leads to strategy without interaction. The player cannot intervene once a mission begins, cannot influence the operation while it is running, and cannot actively participate in its resolution. Yes, it has a lot of narrative potential, showing the full map of the continent. It leads up to the idea that the Inquisition is a multinational organization operating on multiple fronts. The player explores the world and handles major conflicts personally while the agents are working behind the scenes. It is brilliant in theory, in practice it is just a shallow attempt to simulate leadership and strategic decision making. An interesting idea brought low by an implementation that never fully realizes the potential of the concept. And there is a bigger reason why these two systems behave the way they do. It is again related to the world design philosophy patented by Ubisoft. The main story is very short, possibly under 20 hours if you just do the bare minimum. I had somewhere around 50 hours with some extra help from the DLCs. Add to this mess the fact that the side quests are blatant trivialities and fetch quests, and there you have it. It is imperative for the survival of this game to trick you into spending more time in it. In the end, you end up with a world that has massive disconnected zones that don't interact with each other. There aren't any problems in one zone that requires you to help another, so they end up as completely individual places even though you need to level up in multiple zones. The game world starts to resemble a series of large quest hubs rather than a cohesive world. It looks enormous, but functionally behaves like a collection of isolated activity arenas. This design philosophy was extremely common in the early 2010s AAA games, especially during the rise of large open worlds, but in a series like Dragon Age the shift is particularly noticeable. The result is a world that is visually impressive, mechanically busy but emotionally hollow, and this leads up to the next chapter.
Enchanters, the time has come to be alive in the circle of Magi where we will thrive with
Something struck me as odd while documenting the use of mounts in Dragon Age Inquisition. Putting aside the fact that mounts in this game are poorly implemented, something much stranger happens here. Their proportions feel wrong, their controls are awkward, and their movement never quite feels natural. Also, a lot of players have zero incentive to use them as they eliminate one of the most fun aspects of these games, character banter. But the real problem is even more curious. Mounts do not actually make travel meaningfully faster. In some situations, they even feel slower than simply running on foot. And that's when something clicked. In many open world games, developers control pacing by manipulating how long it takes the player to move through the environment. Inquisition zones are deliberately designed with long travel distances and limited fast travel options, especially during the early stages of exploration. The player spends a surprising amount of time simply moving between objectives. This becomes particularly noticeable because most activities in the game are extremely short. Closing a rift, clearing a camp, or collecting a resource usually takes only a couple of minutes. The journey to reach these objectives often takes longer than the activity itself. Fast travel is tied to camps, which must first be discovered and claimed. Until these camps are unlocked, the player is forced to traverse large areas manually. This means that every new region begins with long stretches of travel before efficient movement becomes possible. This design technique is commonly known as travel friction. When combined with terrain obstacles such as cliffs, winding paths, narrow passages, and elevation changes, travel becomes significantly slower. Even when objectives appear close on the map, the actual route required to reach them often involves long detours. In older games, this kind of pacing was something enforced with invisible walls. In Inquisition, the same effect is achieved through terrain design. The result is a clever illusion. Because the player spends so much time moving through the environment, the world feels larger and the game feels longer than the actual gameplay content might justify. A short activity combined with long travel time creates the impression of meaningful progression. But when the activities themselves lack depth, the illusion begins to break down. The world becomes enormous, visually impressive, and constantly asking for the player's attention, yet much of that attention is spent simply navigating between icons representing trivial tasks. Instead of rewarding exploration with meaningful discoveries, the game often asks the player to spend long periods of time traveling through the environment in order to complete objectives that carry very little narrative or mechanical significance.
Enchanters, the time has come to be alive in the circle of Magi where we will thrive with
The crafting system in this game is probably the only redeeming quality. Credit where credit is due. Compared to the previous installments, crafting actually matters here and is by no means optional. Some of the best equipment in the game is obtained through active engagement with this system. Inquisition somehow succeeded where many other RPGs catastrophically failed, and I love that. Crafting in Dragon Age Inquisition is surprisingly well designed. It is deep enough to matter but simple enough to understand. The system revolves around three main elements: schematics, materials, and crafting stations. Instead of relying entirely on finding powerful equipment through exploration or quests, the player can craft weapons and armor using schematics discovered throughout the world. The final quality of the item depends entirely on the materials used in the recipe. Materials are divided into three major categories: metal, leather, and cloth, and there are dozens of them scattered throughout the world. The variety is quite impressive. Each material provides different stat bonuses such as increased damage, critical chance, guard generation, or elemental resistance. This means that two players crafting the same schematic can end up with completely different results depending on the materials they used. Weapons and armor can also be modified with additional components such as grips, pommels, and armor upgrades. And what makes this system even better is that these modifications actually change the visual appearance of the item. Another excellent feature is masterwork crafting. Certain rare materials allow the player to add powerful passive effects to the equipment, dramatically altering how characters perform in combat. The system also uses three types of crafting slots: utility, offense, and defense. The stat bonuses provided by materials depend on the slot in which they are placed. Higher tier schematics require more materials but also contain more slots, allowing the player to create significantly more powerful equipment. Most RPGs, including Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2, implemented crafting systems that existed mostly as an afterthought. Inquisition, on the other hand, actually invested time in designing a crafting system that is functional, flexible, and genuinely enjoyable. And I have to admit that I was pleasantly surprised. Some players argue that it undermines one of the traditional principles of RPGs, rewarding exploration with powerful loot, but personally I don't mind it. The system is engaging enough to stand on its own, even if it challenges a long-established RPG convention. I had an absolute blast experimenting with different schematics and materials. I even went out of my way to hunt dragons just to obtain rare crafting resources. This is a lesson BioWare should remember. If you want to create a great system, you absolutely can. The problem is rarely technical, it is usually a matter of priorities. Of course, like many systems in Inquisition, crafting can also be abused. For example, the Gordon Hit Masterwork effect can become extremely powerful. But that problem is less about crafting itself and more about how the combat system handles damage events. The game registers every hit as a separate trigger, even when those hits are part of a multi-hit ability. This allows certain builds to generate guard almost continuously, creating characters that are far stronger than the combat balance originally intended. I also have to add that the armor in this game looks so beautiful. I was so excited every time I obtained a new schematic. This is how armor should look like. This proves that BioWare is capable of creating good systems. So the only conclusion I can draw from this aspect is that they simply do not want to. If you can and don't do it, this means you are not willing. It is a basic deduction.
Enchanters, the time has come to be alive in the circle of Magi where we will thrive
So, was Dragon Age Inquisition worthy of the Game of the Year award it received in 2014? The answer, as it is often the case with this series, is complicated. If you ask me personally, I would not have voted for Inquisition that year. Inquisition is not a bad game, in fact in many ways it is an impressive one. The production values are enormous, the art direction is beautiful, the companions are memorable, and the world of Thedas remains one of the most interesting fantasy settings created in modern RPGs. When the game focuses on its narrative strengths, it manages to capture some of the magic that made the series special. But beneath those strengths lies a very different design philosophy. The systems that define Dragon Age Inquisition often feel less like the evolution of a classical RPG and more like the result of industry trends. The shift towards massive open worlds filled with repetitive activities, the reliance on progression gating through the power system, and the passive timer mechanics of the war table all point toward the game design to stretch playtime rather than deepen the player's experience. The combat system itself reflects this same identity crisis. It attempts to preserve the tactical heritage of Dragon Age Origins while simultaneously embracing the faster cooldown driven style introduced in Dragon Age 2. The result is a hybrid that functions well enough moment to moment but never fully commits to either philosophy. And yet among all these conflicting ideas, the crafting system stands out as a rare success. It is flexible, meaningful, and genuinely rewarding to engage with. It proves that BioWare was still capable of designing systems that empower the player instead of simply occupying their time. In many ways, Dragon Age Inquisition feels like a game caught between two eras. One part of it still carries the DNA of the traditional BioWare RPG. The characters, the lore, the narrative ambition. The other part reflects the changing priorities of AAA industry. The result is a game filled with contradictions. It is ambitious yet unfocused, impressive yet strangely hollow. A world that is enormous but often lacking the meaning that defined the series. Dragon Age did not collapse here, but this was clearly a turning point. The question that remained after Inquisition was simple. Would BioWare return to the design principles that built the series in the first place, or would the future of Dragon Age continue down this new path? By the time this episode is released, I will have already finished Veilguard, and just as a foreshadowing, you owe me 60 euros already. So if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing to my channel, Hexgrid Scientist. Leave a like, a share and a comment, and I will gladly see you next time.